Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to the class, both to new and long-time students and lovers of history. This is History with Sire here today to discuss with you more about the Battle of the Somme in 1916. If you haven't already, do check out the first two videos on this series. They'll give you some key background about what happened leading up to the Somme Offensive and also the key things that happened on the first day of the Somme Offensive. Some of you actually were quite right to point out in the lesson previously that it wasn't technically the first day, it's actually the first week, as we say, because the bombing campaign had been going on from the artillery, and then, of course, the first day of them stepping out was actually a week after the offensive actually begun. That's a fair comment to make. As I say, this is for GCSE and A-level students, so we are taking the simple route of focusing on the first day and treating the first day as when the British actually went over the top into no man's land. But it's worth querying, and I thank you for that engagement. As I say, we are going to go into the parts beyond the first day now and take our knowledge further. But as we say, when we finished last lesson, we have to understand the Somme Offensive was more than just a single day or even a week of combat. This is going to go on for months. It's going to go on all the way up to November and become a key part of British culture and memory in the nation. So we've got to bear that in mind. And so it's only right that as historians, we learn more, understand more, and take it further. So with that in mind, notepads and pens at the ready, let us carry on now and learn about what happened in the rest of the campaign. So to begin, I first want us to think about the actual German perspective. We talked a lot about the British last lesson and how they saw this as a massive defeat, a massive tragedy. But for many of the Germans, they actually characterized it as a near brush with defeat. It's important to remember that in that week-long bombardment, we had people, we had young men, some of them boys, who were under in those bunkers, sustaining the bombardment that the British were unleashing upon them. And so many of them became psychologically strained from the bombings. I mean, just imagine it for yourself. You're in this 30-meter deep bunker. You're not seeing the light of day for a full week. And all you can hear is the thud, the bang, the constant noise of these artillery shells and bombardment just striking your position. Also, just imagine lying there with your friends, people you know, and just thinking, this could be it. We could actually die. The whole structure could cave in, it could collapse on us, we'd be swallowed by the ground, and there'd be no way out. This was the mindset of many German soldiers who were under those bunkers and really struggled with it and felt the strain of the combat. And yes, while they did get out quickly and fight back against the British with the machine guns, with their snipers holding their positions, the memory of what had come just before from those bombings stayed with a lot of the soldiers and would not be forgotten. As we said as well, the Somme position did have some breaches, did break to the British and French attacks, and actually was for a time going to fall through. It was only by the swift action of the German reserve units that came in and plugged the gap and launched counterattacks that the position did not actually fall. It really would be a totally different story if the British had managed to hold their positions and turn that little breach into a full-on breakthrough and eventually do a flank around the north. So we've got to bear that in mind. It wasn't an easy day for the Germans, despite what it may have felt like for the British after their mass losses. It's also worth noting the Germans did lose men on the day. It was only around 1/10 of the numbers the British lost, but all the same, a few thousand soldiers, with many others wounded and, as we said, psychologically strained from the bombings. That's still quite a big impact we have to bear in mind. And the last part as well, the Germans were still on the defensive. The offensive actions were occurring at Verdun. These ones here on the Somme were in the defensive positions. Yes, they had the better trenches. Yes, they were more structurally strong. But they had no real way of stopping the British from attacking again. As long as the British had the courage, had the fortitude to keep churning out and attacking onwards, the Germans were stuck. They were not going to retreat, and so many of them were going to commit to suffering this psychological and attritional war that the British were going to unleash upon them. So do bear that in mind as we consider the rest of the campaign the British undergo. So as I said, this is the Somme Offensive beyond the first day. Now, what actually happened? One thing we have to understand here is, did the British actually learn anything from that first day? Well, the truth is that they did as we go into the rest of July and into the rest of the summer and autumn of the campaign. Haig ensured that there would be numerous changes that would occur to ensure the disaster did not happen again. He actually brought in Herbert Gow to assist Rawlinson and ensured that this time all men, not just some, all of them were going to run when they did offensives. There would be no hint of commands, no hint of permission for them to walk and stagnate. They would understand that quick, swift action was going to be what was going to win this combat and win this war. They implemented the idea of a creeping barrage rather than, as we said, where Rawlinson's idea was to have the artillery bombard the trench position completely and continuously, and then the British just simply walk across the land and occupy it. Now they were going to creep. What do we mean by this? Well, the artillery was going to bomb the first trench position, and then as it was bombing, the British troops would leave the trench at that moment while the Germans were still trapped underground. The British troops would then advance and they'd be prepared to take the first line of trenches. On cue, the artillery would then move on to the next layer of trenches, while then the British could instantly jump in, leapfrog, and occupy the first line of the trench positions. They would then fight, conduct their maneuvers, fire and move, and then take the position, take the German by surprise, who'd be scrambling out of their bunkers. Then, like clockwork, they would get out and then move on to the next wave of trenches, as the artillery, again like clockwork, was going to time itself and move on to the final layer of trenches and beyond. That was the idea, and this was not going to be perfect from the off, but it was being used. It was going to be timed to ensure that rather than the first wave of soldiers be sent out and die in the fields, they actually would get to the trenches and have a chance at clear victory. Officers were also now given clear permission to have more freedom on the battlefield. Rather than have to wait for orders to be officially changed from divisional command, they could adapt their fighting in the moment rather than have to request that change first. They also were now going to launch attacks at night. We mentioned trench raids back in the trench systems videos, and now they're actually going to put them to use. What is this? Well, a quick reminder, it was actually going to be continuous attacks at night as well as day. They were going to make use of sap trenches, they were going to get up to the positions, raid the trenches, and cause disruption through that manner. And also, as well, by doing attacks at night, they were going to have the concealment of the dark as well to assist them. Another thing that we're going to introduce was new technology. We should hopefully see this image on the left here. This is a tank. Now, tanks, if you check out the video and the lesson we did on weapons of war and the deep dive section on it, the tanks had not been used by the British yet in combat. They were still a relatively new weapon, still being developed, but the British were the ones who had them. They were a new weapon, and the British finally decided to deploy them at the Battle of the Somme. They chose to use them in September at the next major offensive. To be honest, they weren't very useful. They tend to break down, they get stuck in the mud, they were still quite clunky, still quite slow moving, especially for the pace that the attack required. But there was a case at Thiepval where they were quite effective. Touching on that idea, as I said before, how the Germans were psychologically scarred by the bombings and artillery, the tanks were also going to become a fearsome object for the Germans as well. Many Germans would write in their diaries after encountering one that it was a metal monster. Its chuttering of machine guns, its thunderous roar and churning on the ground sent shivers down their spines, not least because it was massive and hulking and never been seen before, but because it was impervious to their own machine guns. There was one machine gun team at Thiepval who unleashed a full magazine belt into one of the British tanks, and all the bullets just bounced and flied off. It did not do anything. They just stood there as then the cannons faced them. It fired and destroyed their emplacement. And this was the reality. This was the reality for them. Tanks were a dangerous and powerful weapon when they were working. And as we see in later conflicts going forward, their role in war was only going to increase as the British became more adept with them, improved their design specifications, and came to use them in many more campaigns. British Army were also gaining immense battle experience. The inexperienced civilian army had evolved itself into a battle-hardened force. These soldiers had learned on the job. They had become more creative, brave, and skilled in their actions. As a result, the Germans did eventually falter, and the battle ended in November as an Anglo-French victory. Let's bring everything together now and summarize what actually happened at the Somme beyond the first day. So, as we established, there were new tactics that were utilized. We had the creeping barrage, where the artillery no longer just stationary and blasting one position continuously. It was now going to move. It was now going to advance on a position and make it easier for the British troops to advance and then occupy it. Again, as we said, this was going to be new. It was going to be developed, but it was working. They were having an easier time occupying positions because now the artillery and infantry were working together. They had combined to become quite effective. We had new weapons in use, such as the tanks, and how, yes, they had their faults. Yes, they were getting stuck in the mud. Yes, they were still quite slow, quite clunky. But when they did work, they were working very effectively. And especially psychologically strained the Germans, brought fear into them of when these metal monsters would attack their position. We also had now battle hardened soldiers, men who had learned on the job, survived those initial campaigns, and were now proving themselves very capable soldiers indeed. But we have to remember, what did they actually gain from this? Well, it was quite little ground overall. They only managed to secure 7 miles of territory. When I tell you that 400,000 Britons and 600,000 Frenchmen gave their lives for 7 miles, it doesn't really sound like it was worth it, does it? And if anything, this was actually 20 miles less than what the High Command had hoped for and planned for. But the counter to this was the Somme Offensive had not been this breakthrough, despite what Hayes' initial dreams had been. The real goal of the Somme had become to relieve Verdun. The French had managed to secure a victory there. By December of 1916, the offensive finally ended with a French victory. This defeat meant that the leader Falkenhayn of the German side was dismissed, and he was eventually replaced by General Hindenburg. The Germans, in total, had lost 650,000 men at the Somme, but they lost 800,000 soldiers at Verdun, and it was very clear to see that the effects of attritional war were beginning to show on the German army. Although, yes, they inflicted similar casualties on the British and French. You may remember when I said about Britain in our first video on this series, they were an empire. They had soldiers coming in from wider forces from Canada, Australia, New Zealand. And so it was the Germans who were now the ones who were lacking the men to hold the lines. The Germans now lacking the men to fully hold their lines. They were going to have to retreat a full 25 miles, not just here at the Somme, but across the entirety of the Western Front. This fallback point we dubbed the Hindenburg Line. It was this massive concession of space and France's survival that had become the victory here at the Somme. In the long term, the sacrifice would prove worthwhile because it had forced the Germans to give up this ground, and it actually proved that an attritional style of war was going to lead to victory eventually. However, the cost of victory was the lives of thousands of young British men, and this was only going to grow for victory to be fully achieved at the end of the war in 1918. And there we are. That concludes the third part of the series here on the Battle of the Somme. I hope you found this useful. Hope you found it insightful. What has been the major thing you've learned so far? Did the British really undergo a learning curve in the combat? What surprised you as well about what was different compared to the first day and now the rest of the campaign as it goes on? Of course, there's only the third part in the series. Will be one more part to release for our following lesson where we bring it all together and assess the Somme campaign as a whole. So do stick around for the final part in the series. A lot of focus there, as I say, for the student level at GCSE and A level. Some key decisions, key judgments we should try and make as historians. If you want to have any further reading on the topic, do consider checking the description box below. I always leave a few of the sources that I've used and read when making this lesson for you, so do of course check those out. This has been History with Sire. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in class again soon. Thank you for listening.